Well, hello. I'm glad you could join me. There's always room by the fire for one more, especially when you've got such great stories as what I've got today. Thank you for joining us for Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. So, let's roll right on in with 5 more great tales. Sometimes house cats can be a little bit lazy. Mine are certainly no exception. But sometimes when you need something done, you have to use a little bit of bribery, especially when you need your cat to catch a rat.
It was a pretty normal thing to ask of a cat. Catch the rat and get your reward. I moved recently, and somehow I got a rat in my stuff. The apartment I had moved from was kind of a dump, but I'd never had a problem with rats. So when I opened the box and out came a big black wharf rat, I nearly had a heart attack. It came barreling out of the box and ran right behind my stove, all 3 of my cats watching it curiously from the top of the couch where they were perched. I remember glowering at them, little cowards, but being madder at Calvin more than the others. The other 2 were little more than kittens, half-grown and barely out of eating dry food soaked in gravy. Calvin, however, was a full-grown cat. I hadn't set out to have 3 cats in a 1-bedroom apartment, of course. It just kinda happened by mistake. Calvin had been a birthday present from my mom. He'd been a scrawny little orange kitten, and she had meant for him to keep me company in my new studio apartment. She had pulled him out of her pocket with a little flourish, and I had sighed as I tried to refuse him. He was very cute, his inquisitive amber eyes looking around with curiosity, but I really didn't want something to take care of right now. Keep him for the weekend. If you still don't want him, I'll come back and get him, she said. By Monday, you couldn't have taken him from me by any means less than high explosive. He was a playful little thing, always zooming around and getting into trouble, and I spent many nights with him curled up in my lap or sitting on my feet as I went to sleep. After a few months, though, he became kind of sluggish and mopey. I talked to a friend of mine, and she said he was probably lonely. She told me that cats are social creatures, and that it might perk him up if he had a little playmate. I talked to Mom, and she told me that the lady she'd gotten Calvin from had just had another litter of kittens. Calvin's brother cousin would probably be ready to leave his mom soon, and I could have a little friend for Calvin to play with. That's how Hobbs came to be my new addition. Before he could even arrive, though, I found Grayson. I was just walking through the Dollar General parking lot, just wanting to get a few things for dinner, when this pathetic little mew from under a giant truck caught my attention. He was a half-starved little gray kitten, scared and lost and looking for help. He was too small to even fight me when I picked him up and put him in my shirt pocket. I picked up a few things while I was inside, a water bowl and some wet food, and Grayson joined my growing little brood of cats. Calvin hated him at first, hissing and spitting at this interloper. But after a few weeks, I saw them playing and running together like old friends. Grayson seemed to idolize Calvin, and when I brought Hobbs home, the 2 of them hissed and spit at him until they finally accepted him as part of their world. The Littles, as I started calling them, followed Calvin around ceaselessly, and he was a good big brother and showed them how to be productively mischievous, as house cats often are. Then, when I got a raise at work, finally making the sort of money that could change my life, I moved out of my dingy studio apartment and into a nice 2-bedroom in a better part of town. And now, I had a rat. I spent the first 2 weeks in my new apartment ignoring him. I could hear him scuttling around, but I hoped he would leave on his own. I had 3 cats after all. Rats are supposed to leave if they smell a cat, right? This fellow didn't care about the existence of my timid little felines, though. He ate my snack cakes from the cupboard, torn into my breakfast cereal, and chewed holes in my bread and dry goods. After the 3rd morning of grabbing a cereal box and finding the contents spilling out onto the linoleum, I got angry. That's when I started trying to get rid of the damn rat. I put out traps, I put down glue boards, I bought poison and put it out in places that I knew would be hard for the cats to get to. I filled any hole I could find with steel wool and spray foam and hot pepper granules. When that failed to get the results, I hired an exterminator to come and have a look. To my surprise, he put down traps and bait and said he'd be back in a week. I rolled my eyes after he left, thinking that I had already done all that. When that failed to get any result too, I started getting desperate. I bought those little noise generator things that are supposed to drive rats crazy. I bought candles that are supposed to make them go nuts. I used essential oils and left out different smelly foods that are supposed to drive them away. Nothing made any progress, though. That's when I really started to get angry at my cats. I shouldn't have taken out my frustration on them, but I was becoming ridiculous. There's 3 of you. How is it that you can't catch one freaking rat? He's been eating your cat food too, you know, chewing holes straight into the bag. Are you really going to let him get away with that? The 3 of them just stared at me blankly, not understanding a damn thing I said. Okay, how about this? The first one of you who gets that rat gets a can of wet food. The good stuff, too. The $3 a can stuff. That seemed to perk them up. Once the cats were out of kittenhood, I had weaned all of them off of wet food. I hadn't given them wet food in nearly 6 months, and they had spent the last 3 months mewing and looking at me expectantly anytime I opened a can of soup or ravioli. Cats aren't stupid. I had always suspected as much, and the way the 2 smaller ones looked at each other left little doubt that they were plotting something. Grayson and Hobbs were younger than Calvin, and they often worked together to manage mischief pretty well. Calvin, on the other hand, looked thoughtfully and stared off at the kitchen. Later that night, as I curled up in bed, I noticed that Calvin was missing from my usual cuddle pile. Grayson was sprawled across my chest, Hobbs laying on my pillow as his fluffy body lay across the top of my head, but Calvin's comfortable weight was absent from my legs. Calvin had slept across my legs every night since he'd come to stay with me, and it was strange now to be thinking about sleep without him there. I called him, patting the bed and pss-pss-pssing at him, but he refused to come to bed. Finally, I just rolled over and went to sleep. He'd turn up. When he finally turned up, it was to show me the dead wharf rat dangling from his teeth. I woke up slowly as the big yellow cat put his paws on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw the dead rat hanging inches from my face. I struggled awake, startled back to consciousness, as the cat proudly held the rat by the tail and dangled it in front of me. The other 2 came sniffing around, looking reverently at Calvin and his prize, but he hissed and spit as he scared them back. This was his prize alone. He followed me into the kitchen, the rat still swinging as I looked through the cabinets for any wet food we might have left over. I found a can of Old Fancy Feast, something I had picked up for a special occasion, and when it went plop into the bowl, he dropped the rat and began to eat. As he dipped his head to eat, I got my first look at the rat. It was unbloodied, its fur unruffled from a fight, and the way its body had curled made me think that Calvin had jumped on him and broken his back. I swept him into a dustpan and dumped him out onto the fire escape, leaving him out there for the scavengers to pick apart. I heard Calvin hiss at the littles as they came close, scattering them before he went back to eating. I reflected that it might have been a mistake to introduce Calvin to wet food again. Calvin had, after all, been the hardest to break. He had never really had it before the kittens came into the house, to my knowledge. He'd been big enough for dry food when Mom brought him to me. Until Grayson had come, he had never had a taste. Grayson had been small, much smaller than Calvin, and I had quickly learned that they could not eat anywhere near each other. Calvin would take Grayson's food without hesitation, snarfing up all the wet food as quickly as possible. It didn't seem to matter if it made him sick or not. He would fill his belly with as much wet food as he could get, and then flop down in a contented ball. It got to the point where I had to feed Grayson in my bedroom, the poor little kitten wasting away as his food was stolen again and again. I did the same with Hobbs, but Calvin still seemed to find a way to take their food sometimes. Calvin was sneaky, and when his amber eyes found something they wanted, he tended to get it. I should have known when he flopped over, his belly full, that this wouldn't be the last. The next night, as I was getting ready for bed, I walked into my room and yelped in horror as I nearly tripped over a second dead rat. This one was a little smaller, a little more normal rat-sized than the wharf rat Calvin had brought me the night before. As I inspected it, he crept silently up and butted my leg. He looked pleased with himself, looking at me expectantly as he waited for his prize. I tried to be supportive of his latest kill, admonishing him as I put out what little wet food I still had. I made a mental note to get more tomorrow. He watched me smugly as I came home with 2 more cans, hoping I wouldn't need them. He took that night off, but the next night, 2 2 small mice were in front of my bedroom door. This was becoming ridiculous. How was my apartment this infested? I hadn't seen so much as a roach or a mouse turd anywhere other than from the big rat that Calvin had killed. Not in the cabinets, not behind the fridge, not anywhere. Suddenly, Calvin was turning up with 4 to 5 times the number of rodents I had thought I had. And that was a problem. I made a note to call an exterminator the next day and disposed of the carcasses. I gave him the wet food and went to bed, figuring I would have a long day tomorrow. I called the exterminator on my lunch break, and he agreed to come out that afternoon. He met me at the door to my apartment, wearing an orange jumpsuit and carrying a heavy can of poison. He introduced himself as Mark. He asked me what I had going on, and I told him that my cats had been catching a lot of vermin since I moved in. He said that was pretty common, especially this close to the canal, and he said he'd have a look. The littles immediately came over to rub up against him, but I noticed that Calvin was keeping his distance. He looked at the exterminator distrustfully, keeping his perch atop the bookcase as his tail flicked unhappily. Mark set to work immediately, checking under the counters and shining his UV light around as he tried to find the rat's sign. He went through the kitchen, the bathroom, my bedroom, and finally checked the living room before making his way into my office. He said he hadn't found any rat sign, other than a small amount of scat under the sink. He said it looked like a single rat might have been here briefly, but that would explain the stowaway I found in my belongings. But what about the other 3, I asked. Mark shrugged. No clue. I'll come back in a week and check the glue traps, but I don't think I'll find anything. I told him I'd call him if anything changed, and he left after a few more pets from the littles and a few more glowers from Calvin. That night, Calvin came up with another rat. I praised him again, but I was beginning to wonder where he was coming up with all these rats. By the end of the week, it was really starting to get out of hand. Calvin had brought me a total of 10 rats throughout the week, as well as 2 roaches and a grasshopper. He had eaten wet food every night that week, and the littles were clearly starting to feel some sort of way about it. They woofed down their dry food, but I could see a lot of hooded glances towards Calvin as he dined on canned food. I was tempted to give them all wet food, but that would only make it harder to break the cycle once the rats stopped appearing. No, eventually Calvin would stop finding rats and bringing them to me, and the whole thing would just go away. Then, Hobbs decided to change the game. After feeding everyone and making sure their water bowls were full one night, I was heading to bed when I stopped in front of the door and looked for Calvin's latest offering. Calvin had been leaving me offerings there since the first night he had brought me the giant rat, and tonight was the first night in a while that I hadn't almost stepped on a dead mouse or a rat on the way to bed. I looked around, thinking he had left it near the door, but there was nothing. Calvin came up then, looking proud of himself, but seemed confused when he couldn't find anything. That's when Hobbs strolled up with a dead mouse swinging from his teeth. Hobbs laid the mouse at my feet, and I bent to congratulate him on his kill. He accepted my pets, eyes straying to Calvin, and I could swear that Calvin stared hatefully at him. It's hard to tell with cats sometimes. Their faces can be a little inexpressive if you're not used to them. Still, I saw Calvin crinkle his eyes and glower at Hobbs, the same way he had glowered at the exterminator. He sat on his bookcase and stared daggers at the little kitten as he ate his wet food. I looked at the 2 of them, wondering if I should leave them alone out here. I shrugged it off, though. They had never tried to hurt each other before, aside from some playful wrestling, and when Grayson followed me to bed, I tipped the door a little so they could come to bed when they were finished. The next morning, though, there was no sign of Hobbs. There was no sign of a struggle, either. Everything was as I had left it the night before. The door was locked, the floors were clean, nothing was amiss at all. It was as if Hobbs had simply vanished. I asked around the apartment complex, hoping maybe he had gotten out, but no one had seen hide nor tail of the little guy. I came home feeling very upset, and Grayson and Calvin tried their best to comfort me. I went to bed with Grayson curled up on my chest, missing the fluffy weight of Hobbs at my head. Calvin, however, stayed out in the living room. He seemed forever on the hunt these days. A week went by, and I still found myself filling Hobbs's bowl and calling for him at bedtime. Grayson was becoming standoffish towards Calvin. I usually came home to find them apart, staring at each other apprehensively. Calvin, on the other hand, pranced around like the lord of the house. There was at least one mouse or rat by the door of my room every night at bedtime, and Calvin was becoming larger than I thought a cat his size should be. He had been the size of a normal house cat a month ago, but now he was approaching the size of a small wild cat. I had chalked it up to all the wet food, but then the other rodents started showing up. On Monday, Calvin brought me a white rat. Calvin had started bringing them to me himself, lest we have another Hobbs incident where someone else took credit for his handiwork. When he set it down, I remembered thinking that it seemed oddly filled out for a wild rat. The rat had been taken care of and looked as though it had been fed regularly. I gave Calvin a hard look, but he only looked at me mildly with those amber eyes as if to say, "It's a rat, wet food now." I sighed and opened him a can, Grayson following closely at my heels as we went to bed. On Tuesday, Calvin brought me a squirrel. It was clearly a squirrel, though the tail had been chewed off. It wasn't a baby squirrel either, or some half-starved yearling. This was a full-grown squirrel that my cat was trying to pass off as a rat. I gave him the food, but I told him not to lure squirrels into the house anymore. He pretended to listen, relishing his wet food as he ate. On Wednesday, Calvin brought me a hamster. There was no disguising this one. He was red and white, his little cheeks stuffed with seeds, and by this point, I was making excuses. Maybe it had crawled in from the vents. Maybe someone's pet had gotten loose and wandered into the apartment. There was no way Calvin could get out of the apartment, right? On Thursday, Calvin brought me a guinea pig. He didn't even try to hide his smugness this time. Calvin flopped the fat little sausage of a rodent down and looked up at me expectantly. His eyes, had they always been that color? I remember them being more amber than crimson. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Perhaps I was just seeing things. My hands shook as I opened the can, and I closed the door this time as I went to bed. Calvin had grown another 3 inches seemingly overnight, and I was having a harder and harder time discerning his growth patterns without apprehension. Then, on Friday, I came home from work to find my landlord out in the hallway. I just thought I'd ask if maybe you'd seen my chinchilla. I told him I didn't know what a chinchilla looked like, to be honest, and he sighed. "It's my daughter's. It's missing. I paid over $1,000 for that little monster, and now he's just suddenly disappeared. If you see him, please let me know." I was waiting for Calvin that night when he came trotting in, the chinchilla holed snugly between his teeth. That's when I lost my temper with him. I told him this was unacceptable. He couldn't just go around killing people's pets. He had probably been catching other pets and killing them as well, and I was tired of it. I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and Calvin yowled miserably as I dragged him to the pet carrier. I put him in and locked the door, the spring locks keeping it shut. He could spend the night in the carrier to think about what he had done. He yowled and morowled as Grayson and I went to bed. I heard him kicking around in there as I tried to sleep. After a little while, though, he quieted, and I finally went to bed. I woke up to an empty bed, though. I looked around for Grayson, expecting to have him curled up next to me, and finding nothing. Again, there was no sign of a struggle, no blood or evidence of foul play, just a lack of cat and a sense of absence. I left the room, my eyes inevitably straying to the cat carrier in the corner as I searched the house for Grayson. Calvin and Hobbs had been like children to me, but Grayson had been special, even amongst my cats. I felt like I had saved him, like I had kept him from dying, and now he was gone. I had to halt my search to stop myself from sobbing more than once. After I'd checked every room in the house, every hiding place, every nook and cranny, I turned my attention back to the pet carrier. It had been silent the whole time, unmoving and seemingly empty. I moved in slowly, not sure what to expect. Was Calvin dead too? He had spent a lot of time last night yowling, and now he was as silent as the grave. I bent low, putting my face near the mesh and looking in to find nothing. The pet carrier was empty. I jumped when someone knocked on my door, their thumping sounding frantic. It was the landlord again, and he looked very pale. "Excuse me, I'm going door to door. Have you seen, I mean..." He lost what little composure he had, and I felt his face press against my shoulder, his tears moistening my shirt. My son's missing. Have you seen anyone who might have taken him? I put him to bed in his crib last night, and when I woke up this morning, he was just gone. His mother's nearly catatonic, and the police can't find any evidence of a break-in. I don't know what to do. I'm seeing if anyone has seen anything. It's all I know to do." I commiserated with him, telling him that I would let him know if I saw anything, but my guts were already a-roil with fear. Surely he hadn't. There was no way. He was there on the coffee table as I closed the door, tail flicking in agitation. There was something in his mouth, something thick and pink, and as he rose up and sauntered over to me, I backed away, not wanting to see what it was. He was leaving little red splotches on the floor in his wake as he carried the strange offering to me, and I was even more certain that I didn't want it anywhere near me. However, when my bottom came up hard against the door, I was out of room to retreat. He lay the offering at my feet, looking up coldly with none of his usual smugness, and staying put to watch as I pushed it over with the toe of my shoe. Even without the toes, I could tell it was a small, delicate foot that someone had unceremoniously detached from the owner. The foot of an infant, if I had to guess. He's out there now, eating his wet food as I lay in bed with the doors locked. I flushed the remains of the small foot down the toilet. It flushed surprisingly easy, but I saw Calvin watching me the whole time from the door. All he does now is watch me, and I'm frankly afraid to touch him. He's different, not really like a cat anymore, and when he tried to jump in my lap earlier, I pushed him away. I just can't stand to have him near me. However, I'll be giving him his wet food from now on, rat or no rat. I'm afraid of what might happen if I let him get too hungry.
Fire's really going. It's always nice to sit warm and cozy by a fire and tell some great stories. We've all had some weird jobs before. I hope yours wasn't quite as weird as old Howard's here. So let's come with him as we go on a journey to see where it all shakes out for poor Howard, as we listen to Howard's song.
The smooth jazz buzzed through his ears as Howard finished correlating the numbers for his latest job. The Baxter account was coming along nicely. Howard felt quite sure that he would have the account books done before quitting time. It had been a hard job. Mr. Baxter had not kept good records, but he had finally chased down all those loose ends, and... Howard cocked his head like a dog that's heard a sound he can't quite place. Had someone been calling him? The smooth jazz he always listened to when he worked was devoid of words. Words tended to distract him while he was working. He shook his head and got back to it. The account was nearly done, and he had a meeting in an hour to finalize it. He'd give his boss something to crow about this time. Charles Baxter was a very wealthy man, and his business would do wonders for the company. Howard bet his boss would give him a bonus after seeing all the excellent work he'd... Howard! Howard turned to look behind him. Someone had said his name, almost spoken it in his ear. As he looked around, he was perplexed as to where it was coming from. Looking back to the computer, he began to type again. His nerves were a little rattled at the thought of a disembodied voice and... Howard! Howard jumped and nearly overturned his chair. Someone had shouted his name, screamed it right into his ear. Even now, as he looked around his home office, he could see no one. Howard lived alone with no wife or children or roommates to distract him, and the thought of someone in his house made him very upset. This was his home, his place of refuge, and as he started to rise from his chair, he resigned himself to search the whole house until whoever was here was found. He had just opened the closet when the voice spoke again. "Sorry to startle you, Howard. Now that I've got your attention, I need to talk to you." Howard stared dumbly into the closet. The old jackets and blue storage bins did not begin to speak to him. No one sprang from concealment either to admit to the disturbance, and he came to realize that the voice was not coming from the house. The voice was not an intruder, or a disembodied ghost voice, of which he did not believe in. The voice seemed to be coming from his earbuds. The voice was that of an average, everyday person. Howard could have sat next to him on the bus, or chatted with him in line for his morning bagel. The voice was smooth, educated, and not too terribly unlike his own. This made Howard feel a little easier, a little calmer. As he stood looking into the coat closet, he felt less worried about home invaders and more concerned about why someone in his earbuds knew his name. "Wonderful. Now that I have your attention, I need you to leave the house." That struck Howard as odd. Not that anything in this situation was expected, but leaving the house? Howard worked mostly from home, always had after his employer had determined that it was better for his productivity. As such, he had maintained a rigorous schedule. He really only left the house to get groceries once a week, and to visit a certain woman he liked. Their relationship was based on cash exchange only, of course, but he still had a schedule, and he liked to stick to it. "You are in great danger, Howard. Men are coming to hurt you. Men who don't want you to finish this account. And if you're still here when they arrive, I fear you won't live to see tomorrow." This filled Howard with unease. Who was coming to hurt him? Why did they care so much about the Baxter account? "I know this must be very upsetting to you, Howard, but I need you to do exactly as I say, so we can get you out of this troublesome situation. Take all the relevant information you have on the account and put it into your briefcase. Take the hard drive out of your computer, the silver box on the second tray, and put it in there as well. You can just yank it right out. It should come free. I need you to do all of this in the next 5 minutes and be at the bus stop before 2 o'clock. Go on. Get started now." Howard felt himself hesitating. Who was this voice? Why was he talking to him? How did he know that this wasn't some trick to get him to screw up all the data on his computer? Still, years of being an accountant drone meant that he had already begun to scoop the papers into his briefcase, even as he thought things over. He was used to following orders, and really, this was just one more in a long line of orders. The side of his desktop came off easily. He had saved his documents, of course, and powered it off. Now he had the case open, though, and the nagging voice asked again if he thought he was doing the right thing. This was crazy. He was going to yank a piece out of his computer just because a voice in his earbuds told him to. How did he know he wasn't being fooled? How did he know he wasn't having a mental breakdown? For all he knew, he had created the voice, which hadn't spoken in about a minute, and now he was getting ready to break his computer. "Quickly now, Howard. They're on their way," the voice said, not showing the slightest bit of interest one way or another. Howard reached in, feeling the heat from the components, and gripped the hard drive. He lifted it out of the cradle, but instead of yanking, he detached the cables and easily brought the box out. He looked at it as it ticked and cooled and put it in his briefcase. He closed the case, grabbed his hat from beside the door, and left his house. "Don't bother locking up. You probably won't be back," said the voice in that who cares sort of way. "Now, walk down to the bus stop and sit with the wall blocking your view of the house." Why wouldn't I come back to my house, Howard thought, but he moved to the bus station without really thinking. He was running on autopilot as he came to the bus station and just sat down. The longer he sat, the longer the voice remained silent, the more he doubted that it would come again. A woman with a bratty kid sat next to him, and he clutched his briefcase on his lap. The kid looked up from his gadget, a box that was spewing noise at an ear-splitting level, to tell his mom that he wanted McDonald's when they got wherever they were going. She just patted him and said she would. The kid turned his grubby face back to the gadget then, and gave no more thought to the conscious world whatsoever. That was when Howard saw the car. The black town car drove right past the bus station and into his driveway. 4 men in black suits climbed out and walked towards his door. One of them knocked, 3 loud clumps, and they all waited for 30 seconds in a state of impatient tension. They all had sunglasses on and shiny black shoes. Howard thought they looked like government agents in a spy movie. As he peeked around the bus station wall, he saw one of them drive that shoe right into the door after receiving no answer. As they filed in, he thought he saw them reach into their coats for something. But the voice came back just as a big silver bus pulled up in front of the stop. "Never mind that, Howard. It's not your concern anymore. Just get on and take the bus to the number 12 stop. You can do that, can't you?" As Howard flashed his bus pass and took his seat, he found that he could. He rode the bus for the better part of an hour. He kept a firm hand on his briefcase, and as he rode, his eyes kept sweeping around to look at the other riders. The bratty boy and his doting mother were a few seats away. The kid hadn't looked up from his gadget since he'd spoken to his mother, and she seemed to be busy watching the world go by. An older woman was sitting up near the front with the driver. Her clothes made him think that she might be homeless, and a young man with headphones on was sleeping near the back of the bus. The flashing sign near the front said that they were nearing stop number 4. If the stops were in some kind of order, it would be 8 more stops before it was his turn to get off. He glanced out the window as they drove, the bus stopping occasionally, but rarely picking anyone up. The voice in his earbuds hadn't spoken for a while. He was again beginning to wonder if he'd made the whole thing up. Here he was, on a bus, with his work and his hard drive in a briefcase like some kind of spy. Maybe he had been working too hard. Maybe his boss was right, and he really did need to take some time off. I don't want to alarm you, Howard, but it seems that the men in the town car are following you. Howard bristled. He turned his head slightly and could see the black town car in traffic behind the bus. The windows were polarized, so they couldn't see in, but they certainly knew where he was. It would be easy to find out if he had come onto this bus. He didn't exactly blend in. And then, what would they do? Would they gun him down on the bus in front of all these people? Would they arrest him? Why were they after him? I need you to get off at the next stop, Howard. Don't hesitate. Don't look around. Just step off the bus and take the alley to your left. Howard pulled the handle over his head, and when the bus stopped, he calmly walked out onto the busy sidewalk. The doors closed, and the bus rolled on into traffic. Behind it, the town car followed, being none the wiser that Howard had gotten off. He scanned the crowd and found the alley to his left. He took it, clutching the briefcase as he walked along the garbage cans. He didn't see anyone lingering around, and as he came out onto the other side of the busy street, he began to relax a little. There were no black town cars waiting for him, and that gave him some small amount of reassurance. Now, cross the street and take the next alley to the number 12 stop. There will be a taxi waiting for you there. Take it to your destination. Howard glanced around, unsure until he finally saw the alley. It sat between an Italian restaurant and a computer repair store. Howard could see the large green dumpster that took up most of the lane, and knew it would be a squeeze to get around it. He started across the busy street, and was met by the sounds of horns honking and people cursing. He hurried across like a frightened rabbit, and made the alley before the screeching tires had stopped. The alley was awash with graffiti and the old smells of pasta. Someone had hung some band poster on the wall, but it did little to add to the place's charm. The dumpster was a stinking edifice of green and chrome. Howard was no dainty flower, but he shimmied around it with very little problem. He winced when his stomach rubbed against the filthy dumpster, but he was clear a moment later, and nearly out of the alley. "Stop!" the voice said, and suddenly Howard was against the wall. He made himself as small as he could, and saw the black town car pull up next to the bus stop. "Don't move. Just be still, and they won't see you," said the oily voice in his ear. The man who had kicked in his door stepped out of the car. He bulged in his suit, a mountain of muscles, and Howard had little trouble believing that that man so easily booted in his door. He stepped out and walked to the bus stop. The bus Howard had departed, pulling up and offloading the few passengers. He looked hard at the mother and the brat, the child sticking his tongue out at him, and at the old lady who shuffled up the street. The bull stepped onto the bus and looked around, exchanging words with the driver before climbing off. He and the man in a taxi had another conversation, his town car blocking the sidewalk, which ended with the taxi honking and cursing and speeding away. The town car left a few seconds later, and Howard breathed a sigh of relief. A new taxi pulled up a minute later, and the driver asked Howard if his name was Howard Kernst. Howard climbed in, and they pulled into traffic. They drove until they hit the city limits. Howard had expected to go uptown to one of the glass edifices that marked the government buildings or the high-scale holdings. He had expected to be greeted by a man in a suit who would tell him that he had done well and explain all this. Instead, they drove into the desert. The driver didn't speak, he just drove. Howard was becoming nervous. The men in the town car had been one thing, but what if the man in the earpiece was worse? He tested the door and found that it was locked. He checked the windows and found that they wouldn't open. He tapped on the glass, but the man behind the wheel ignored him. "Patience, Howard," the man soothed. "All your questions will be answered soon." Howard settled a little, but as they drove deeper into the desert, he began to wonder what was happening. Howard was just an accountant, a great accountant, but still an accountant. Things like this didn't happen when you were just an accountant. You might get a paper cut or stub your toe on an average day, but certainly not get yourself involved in clandestine conspiracies or life-or-death struggles. Hell, the files he had from the Baxter account weren't even that interesting. Baxter owed a lot of money to the government, had a lot of back taxes, but Howard had managed to clear that up. His orders had been to make the problem go away, and he had. When the car stopped, Howard was jerked out of his contemplation. They had stopped outside a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere. Howard must have been wool gathering, for longer than he thought, because the sun was dipping low in the sky behind said station, and the afternoon was beginning to sink into evening. A sensible black sedan was parked in front of the gas station, and as they approached, a man opened the door for Howard and ushered him out. The man was wearing a black suit, much like Howard's pursuers, and his sunglasses reflected Howard's scared face back at him as he climbed from the taxi. The taxi driver accepted an envelope from the man, neither speaking a word, and the cab pulled away, leaving Howard and the man standing in front of this rundown gas station. "Right this way, Mr. Ernst," said the man, and the two walked towards the station. It was a tatty thing, gas pumps gone all brown and flaky, the glass crashed out in the windows, a single spindle rack spinning sluggishly in the wind, with a single bloated magazine on it. Howard had seen 1,000 of them in his time, utterly forgettable, and he feared to die in a place like this and become as forgotten as the old station. The thought was sudden, but he couldn't get it loose as soon as he had thought it. He was like a dog who's finally caught his tail and now can't let it go again. Howard was suddenly sure that this would be the place he died. The two walked around the back of the station, and there was a man in a folding chair, a beach umbrella covering him from the sun. He was dressed in a white suit, little blue piping roaming up the jacket. He had a fat, jolly face, hair the color of snow, and a pair of sunglasses with some reflective lenses Howard had become used to seeing. He smiled when he saw Howard, and the smile was genuine and warm. He pulled an earpiece out as they approached, and spread his pudgy arms wide as though to hug him. "At last, Mr. Ernst, at last you've arrived. May I call you Howard? It seems silly to rest on formalities after we've been through so much." Howard didn't trust him from the instant he opened his mouth until the end of his life. The man had a showy way of speaking, like a carnival barker or a snake oil salesman. He was the kind of man who turned everything into a Shakespearean presentation. He thought himself a showman, but really, he was just dramatic for the sake of drama. Howard hated people like that. The man seemed to pick up on some of his distaste. "I imagine you have 12 questions, maybe 24, and I want to answer them all, but I fear we don't have time. The biggest question I assume you have is why these men are chasing you, yes?" Howard nodded a little sullenly. "Well, the answer is quite simple. The men are, of course, my own." "Yours?" Howard asked, perplexed. "Of course. You see, if you had something I wanted, and there was no sense of urgency, you might start to ask questions. You might question the voice that suddenly popped into your head. You might not have come all this way into the desert on my order if I hadn't made the stakes a little high for you." He pulled a cigarette out of a silver case he had in his jacket, and Howard flinched when he saw the case come free. For half a second, he had seen a small silver handgun come out of that jacket, and he knew his life was about to end. The man flipped the case closed, but offered it to Howard before he put it away. Howard declined, and the man slid it back into his pocket with the same disappointment. The man who had escorted him from the taxi stepped close, flicking an expensive lighter and holding it to the end of the cigarette. Howard considered running into the desert while he was occupied. Catching a bullet in the back, however, did not seem much better than dying right here. "Now then, I imagine you'd like to know why I went to all this trouble to get the papers you have in your briefcase. Well, that's a little more complicated. You see, Charles Baxter has made some very important people very angry. He's made enemies out of the kind of men who don't really get mad. They get even. And in 22 hours, he will cease to exist forever. He will be erased from life, erased from memory, and erased from time." Howard gaped. Who was this guy? How exactly did you go about erasing someone from time? Charles Baxter was a fat cat around here, probably one of the most prominent businessmen in 3 states, but surely he was small potatoes in the grand scheme of things, right? So, as you can see, it's very inopportune for you to have files that prove this man existed at all. Charles Baxter is already dead. His associates are, as we speak, being ferreted out. You, Howard, are the last loose end we need to tie up. But why kill me just for having this information?" The man shrugged noncommittally. "Because it's easier than having you reprogrammed. At the end of the day, you're an unmarried accountant whose absence will go unremarked. You have no family, no real friends, not even any pets to mark their bowl's emptiness. You've lived an unremarkable life, Howard. Your death will be much the same." He threw the cigarette into the sand, half smoked, and held his hands out towards Howard. "Now then, the case, please." It was said nice enough, but Howard knew that it wasn't a request. The man was used to giving orders and having them followed, and for a moment, Howard thought about refusing him. He would die here, he knew that, but maybe he could die with some dignity. Perhaps he could die having fought against something that didn't seem right. He held onto the case for a few seconds, not sure what he meant to do with it, but in the end, he found himself handing the case to the man under the umbrella. At the end of the day, he was just an accountant after all. The man accepted the case, smiling, and this time the hand that came out of the suit coat did contain a small silver handgun. "Thank you, Howard. You've been very helpful." The gun went off, and Harold felt the slug enter his body. It burned for a few seconds, then he felt nothing. Howard's life ended in much the same way he had lived it, without much fuss.
Whether it's a campfire, or a fireplace fire, or even an old fire over a barrel that you use to keep warm at night, I'm glad we could all join each other around the fire today. I like to travel. I think everyone does. But when you travel, it's important to be respectful of the natives. Maybe, keeping with custom. Maybe going out of your way a little bit to make sure that you don't stick out. Especially if you're camping, though, it's important to be conscientious of nature and leave only footprints. Well, the subject of today's story, it sounds like, is leaving more than footprints, and it's a habit that catches up with him. So, come with me, and let's meet the Dark Watchers. I've been sitting on this for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know those guys who are all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty and all that? Yeah, that wasn't me. I liked camping. My parents liked camping. But there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip one time, just because Dad knew of a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods, left those by the creek. Garbage, right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Mom and Dad would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig, but in my head, the woods will always take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff gonna mess with it? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there, right? That's what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I'm not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get buzzed. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs with some water, just in case, and just kind of spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kind of got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and the sun started creeping down as I set to lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water, and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering, "Shit," as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something.
They were just silhouettes on the ridge, not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats, like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move, they didn't call out, but I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took some of the edge off. Took any thought of the shadow guys out of my mind whatsoever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night, too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt-out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frozen there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything, they just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole time. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come out here not to say anything? All my stuff was there too, down to the hot dog wrappers I'd left on the ground next to the fire. I tossed it in absent-mindedly and ate eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go for a forest pub crawl today. Translation, I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke, most of them didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. Wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadows that shouldn't have been there. It was midday, the sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water, and when I found a stream, I plunged my face into it to get some clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far behind me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me, but there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I'd felt like I was stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink into me, the teeth to bite, the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was going to come at any minute. I could feel it, and when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me, and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for about 10 minutes just knowing that it would get me when I moved, but it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I'd fallen next to an anthill, and I had accidentally stomped on it in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took me another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they had stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out, and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows, the images burned at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't stir. And as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left, but I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was just being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. I was, but ultimately, I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off into the night and I'd never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge too, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night itself somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking, but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak. And as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms, and you claim to be superior here. The better. You are nothing. You will die and be forgotten. On and on and on. They whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up above my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me, like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something, and when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods and ruin our place, you will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable. If you persist in this folly, we will not be so kind again. Now go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I better not be here when the sun came up. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up my site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they had always said to on TV. Then I took everything with me, and I ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they're waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping, or they don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them.
Where's my fire poker, I wonder? Looks like the fire's getting a little wimpy, and it might need some moving around to get it back up to snuff. Security is always important. That's why today's video is brought to you by... Just kidding. Had you there for a minute. But there's no security system sometimes, like a good guard dog. So, if your activities take you where maybe you shouldn't be, it's always a good idea to beware of dog.
Should have been an easy score. Rob an old man, leave without much fuss. We never could have guessed how south it would go. Everyone had heard of Duncan Adams. He'd been a fixture in the community for generations, living in that wild old house up on Mount Yaller. He'd been a writer, a professor of antiquities at Georgia State College, and any number of other things. His house was supposed to contain all sorts of expensive things, and we were going to see if the rumors were true. Mike didn't like it, though. Guy like that is certain to have all sorts of security, the best measures money can buy, and you just expect the four of us to walk in like it's nothing. Julius, Gavin, Mike, and I like to call ourselves a crew, but that was just from watching too many heist movies. In reality, we were just four guys who like to break into people's houses and steal things. We weren't druggies, we weren't criminals, despite what our records said, but we did like to buy nice things, and stealing often paid for them better than a real job. You'd think so, I said, but my brother went up there to do a job and said that there were no security systems, no cameras, no nothing. The dude is just asking to get robbed, and I say we take him up on it. My youngest brother's a plumber, and that was actually where I got the idea for the job. He got called about a month ago to fix some pipes in the old man's bathroom, and came back to tell us how cool the place was. He had all these mirrors on the grounds, and in the house, and on the walls, and it was like a fun house. It was really cool looking, he said. The old man had paid him a mint to do the job, and I'd spent the next 3 weeks thinking about that house, and planning the biggest heist that I could imagine. The plan is that we go in just after dark and jump the sidewall. We can go in through the garden out back, and come out on the back porch and into the house. The old man's a hard sleeper. My brother said he had to ring the bell a dozen times before he woke up. We can go in and out before he even knows we're there, and live like fat rats off the spoils. Mike still wasn't sure, but greed was slowly eroding his sense of self-preservation. He said he would bring it to a vote with the rest of the crew, and later that afternoon he called to say that the vote had been carried unanimously. The other two were in, and Mike wasn't about to hold us up with some tickling feeling of doubt. Hope your intel's right, because if you're not, we're all going to be royally screwed. And that was how we came to be hunkered in the scrub around the Duncan Adams estate, waiting for it to get good and dark. We were all dressed in dark clothes, Jules and Gavin wearing ski masks, while Mike and I just had our hoods pulled up. I was pretty sure that we wouldn't need cover, but Jules had 2 prior arrests, and Gavin was clean for the moment. Both wanted to stay out of prison, if they could help it, and had opted to cover their faces. As the dark began to settle around us, we kept to the fence and prepared to vault over. It was just a simple concrete wall, no lights or cameras on the top. But Mike stopped before making a stirrup with his hands to point at a sign on the wall. You didn't say nothing about a dog. I looked at the sign, wrinkled my brow as I tried to remember if Lewis had mentioned a dog. He hadn't. He'd said nothing about any kind of animals on the property, but a dog could complicate things. The sign was the usual black and yellow one that bore the legend, "Beware of dog," on it, but it looked a little faded, and I suddenly wondered if it was something from a while ago. It's probably old. Lewis didn't say anything about a dog or a cat or anything to do with animals. Mike seemed unsure, but I doubled down. Tell you what, I'll go first and drop behind the gate. If there's a dog, it'll just tear me up, and I'll find some way to get out, or you guys can run. We'll only be out for the gas it took to get us here, and I'll have spent a night in jail, worst case scenario. Mike still looked unsure, but he made a stirrup with his hands, and I vaulted over the wall and landed in a well-kept backyard. It had been landscaped to look oriental, maybe Japanese or something, and there was a bridge over a little creek and a well-cared-for walkway that led to the back of the house. There was a sand pit with rocks in it, some trees cut to resemble bonsai trees, and several large reflective columns interspaced around. It was definitely different, but I liked it the longer I stood waiting to get mauled by a Rottweiler or a pit bull. "What do you see?" Mike whispered, as I scanned the area for a slobbering beast that was just waiting to strike. "Nothing. Well, not nothing, but no dog. Come on over. I think it's safe." They dropped over one at a time, Mike reaching back to pull Gavin over before landing himself. They all stared at the strange little garden, so alien in the twilight, and when no lights came on to mark them, and no dog came out to chase us away, we all sighed collectively. "Looks like there wasn't a dog after all," Julia said. "Or he's inside," Mike said skeptically. "Whatever. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We gotta get inside first," I reminded them, as we set off across the little garden path. It was a little eerie to walk across the shadowy garden, with only the moon to guide us. The place seemed to be made of strange angles, and the reflective monoliths didn't help matters much. They were everywhere, a new one jutting up every 7 or 8 feet, and they played strange games in the moonlight. I would catch myself looking at them out of the corner of my eye, and more than once I had to turn and make sure something wasn't following us. The reflections created strange shadows, and I was sure I saw something dart out of sight before turning to find nothing and nowhere that it could have gone. "These things are weird," Julia said, keeping his voice pitched low. "I could swear I keep seeing something in them, but it's gone when I look." "Me too," Gavin said, sounding a little unnerved. "Eyes on the prize, boys," I reminded them, but I didn't sound as sure as I tried to convey. The backyard hadn't looked very big, but as we moved towards the house, it seemed to go on forever. We were staying low, trying not to draw attention to ourselves, but it seemed like we should have been there by now. Whenever I looked at the back porch, it always seemed to be about 50 feet away, and every step seemed to bring us no closer. "What the hell was that?" Gavin asked, and his voice was too high. Julia shushed him, whispering back, "What are you talking about?" "There it was again, right there, I saw it," Gavin said, pointing at one of the polished monoliths. I glanced at it, but it was just a flat reflection of the weird trees sitting on the back wall. "There's nothing there, Gav. Get it together, man. In a few hours we'll be leaving with more loot than we can carry. Then you can freak out if you still want to." Gavin looked unsure, but he nodded and kept pace as we made our way through the collection of old trees and topiaries. He wasn't the only one getting a little nervous, though. I could see something in those reflections, too. Something I was beginning to think might be our dog. It was big. Way too big to go vanishing like it always seemed to. It was a mastiff or a wolf hybrid or something, and the longer we trekked through the garden, the closer it seemed to get to us. At first it was just curiously observing us, seeing what we were doing and enjoying its little game of startling us. As we neared the house, though, the game changed. Now it was getting closer to our group, weaving between the statues and plants, getting bigger as it stalked us. I still wasn't sure how it was doing that. The thing had to be nearly 5 feet tall on all fours, but it would disappear any time I turned to look behind me. I wondered if there was some sort of electrical gadget in these things, maybe a display mount to scare intruders, but when I looked right at the polished mirror front, I saw nothing but my own reflection and the larger-than-usual bonsai topiary behind me. I'd like to tell you that we made it to the house before things went sideways, but that's not true. Truth was, We never even saw the inside of the house. We came within about 10 feet of the back porch, a trip that seemed to take longer than it should have when the purpose of the monoliths became apparent. We were hunched around some of the oddities of the garden, trying to get our nerve up before heading in. Gavin and I weren't the only ones that had been seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, and nerves were high as the goal came into view. Now the real work would begin, but we weren't sure what to expect from this funhouse garden. Would we be allowed to make it to the house? Would we be mowed down by some huge hound on our way to the porch? I didn't know, but suddenly this didn't seem like the easy score I had promised them. "Jules," I whispered, "go see if the back door is unlocked." "Why have I got to do it?" Jules asked, his nerves jangling a little. "'Cause you're the closest to the door. Just get up there and see." Jules looked at the house like it was the absolute last place he wanted to go, but greed still had its teeth in him. We could still make something of this, still come out okay, and he scampered up the porch steps with all the stealth he could muster. The doors were glass, fronting on a huge glassed-in kitchen, and when Jules reached out for the handle, he seemed as shocked as we were when it pulled down easily. Damn, guy's not even... But as he took his eyes off the glass, I saw something loom up behind him, something that made me tremble. It was the dog, a huge black hellhound with a gaping maw full of sharp teeth and piercing red eyes. It was behind the glass, and I thought for sure that it would jump through and bury Jules with its bulk. I started to yell, started to warn him, but when it leaned out of the glass and snapped its teeth around him, I was surprised by the lack of a crash. Jules looked surprised too, his shock absolute, and when the creature yanked him into the glass and out of sight, we were left in stunned silence, with only the crickets for company. "What the hell was that?" Gavin said, his voice trembling audibly. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice inches behind me as he inched away with every breath, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." He was off and running then, tearing back towards the wall we'd come over. He looked scared enough to jump it without any help, and when I called for him to stop, I winced as a light came on in the house. Great, we'd woken up the old man. Gavin saw the light and took a few steps back himself, but when Mike screamed suddenly, Gavin and I froze as we turned back to see what had happened. In the fleeting rays of the porch light, I saw Mike caught beneath the massive paws. It was coming from the surface of a polished square, and as the head emerged, the beast looked as big as a grizzly bear. The fur was wiry and stiff, something I believe they called brindled in the dog world, and its muzzle was already dripping with blood. It bent down over Mike, the poor guy screaming and thrashing as much as his smushed lungs would allow, and when it covered his head with its mouth, the crying and yelling was cut off abruptly. It took Mike's head with it, but was nice enough to leave the body behind as it disappeared into the polished surface of the brooding rectangle. Gavin and I just stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. When the door to the back porch opened, we both got low as we tried to hide from whoever had come to check on the ruckus. "Who's there?" said a voice that had probably once been a little more impressive. Age had done it no favors, and now it was a little less impressive, a little less commanding, but the owner seemed to know that he wasn't the most dangerous creature in the garden. The sound of a cane thumping on the boards could be heard, and when he saw the body, he croaked out a rough laugh. "Decided to come and steal from an old man, huh? You didn't think you were the first, did you?" I looked at Gavin as we hid, trying to tell him to be still, though he seemed to be losing that particular fight. "More than a few people have thought that they could come and plunder what I've rightfully taken in my prime.
They see an old man living alone and think to make his home their find of the century. They never guess that the most dangerous thing here might be my own biggest find." As we watched, the old man put out a hand, and the hellish beast stuck its nose out of the window it had sucked jewels into, so the old man could scratch it like any other dog. "I was excavating a tomb in Russia when I found them. These strange black monoliths were just in a cave towards the back of the old tomb. I had never seen anything like them or the beast they held, but it had enough intelligence to understand me when I made it an offer. It didn't seem to be enough that he was going to kill us. The old codger meant to monologue before his hell beast devoured us. 'Come back to my home,' I said. 'Come into the lighted world again, and I will take you from this place and let you hunt my enemies for me.' And so I have. It has hunted a long time on would-be thieves and robbers, and eaten well in the process. You will be no different." Gavin looked at the back wall, a path that would take him over the unmoving corpse of Mike, and seemed to be trying to decide if it was worth the risk. I shook my head at him, trying to tell him not to, but when he suddenly sprinted across the lawn, I found myself right behind him. I could no more stop myself from fleeing in my terror than he could, and we dodged around the monoliths at every opportunity. The hound lunged at us nonetheless, coming out of either side as it tried to stop us. We were neck and neck, nearly to the wall, when Gavin suddenly tripped. I looked back and found that Gavin's foot was stuck in a trap too devilish to escape. The creature had him by the ankle, and as it dragged him backwards, I sprinted for the wall and leapt at the top. My fingers burned as they tried to dig into the concrete, and I'm not ashamed to say that I left a few fingernails behind as I scrambled over the top. I drove home, expecting that the creature or the police would come after me every mile of the way. When it didn't come lunging out of my rearview mirror and no blue and whites dogged my heels, I breathed a sigh of relief. I drove home, locked all the doors in my trailer, and went to my room so I could write this down while it's still fresh. Now that I have, I'm not sure what to do. Do I call the police? What would I even tell them? Can that thing get me through my own mirror? My computer monitor? The surface of my spoons? I don't know what to do. But I do know one thing. If you ever hear of Duncan Adams and his strange house in the mountains, and think that an old man living alone will be an easy score, think again. The dog that he has can't be bribed with treats and pets, and all you'll have from that place is death for you and anyone who comes along with you. One more story for you before I take these tired old bones off for a nap before another great evening of writing and making videos and just spending time with all of you. Sometimes it's not as much fun as you might think to learn the family secrets. Sometimes those are sleeping dogs that might be better left to lie for as long as possible. So, if you're in the mood to hear a little gossip, let's find out why Grandma always said that Grandpa wasn't right.
I've been taking care of my grandma lately. She's been doing pretty bad, and she needs someone to help her almost 24/7. She's got kind of a bone disease or something. It's basically turning her bones into Swiss cheese. And I've had to carry her to the bathroom and room to room for the past couple of weeks. This might seem kind of tiresome to some people, but I'm glad to do it. My grandma and I have always been close. She basically raised me since my mother was never at home. If I can give back to her now, I consider it fair. She's been alone since I was in high school, and those 10 years have been the happiest I've ever seen her. She and Grandpa had been married for decades, 50 years before Grandpa just left, but they never seemed to get along. When I was young, Grandma would always come over and stay the night instead of having me come over there. Grandpa never came to our house. He mostly stayed close to home or went to work, but the few times I interacted with him, he seemed kind of off. Even as a kid, I didn't think he looked right. That might sound a little mean, but over time, he got paler and less coherent. He would mumble to himself with odd whispery things while he was watching TV. Grandma usually kept him in the bedroom with the TV on and the lights off. He disappeared suddenly when I was in the 9th grade, and it had been almost as much of a relief to me as for Grandma. So last week, when I slid her into bed and told her I was going grocery shopping the next day, so, she better get some sleep, she shook her head and looked away. I doubt I will. I think this might be my last night in this bed. Why, you eye in my bed? I'll swap you, but yours is a lot more comfortable than the one I'm in. No, son, she cut me off, her voice thready and weak. I think tonight might be the night I pass on. My eyes got a little big. Do I need to call Miss Sam? If you think you're going to pass, then I should get the nurse out here, too. I don't want them out here. You've been good to me, boy. I just want you here with me at the end. Besides, I need to tell you something. I need to confess my sins before I take them to heaven with me. I mean, I can call Pastor Ferris over if you need to talk to someone about matters spiritual. No, not Bobby Harris either. I want to confess to you. It's family business, and once I confess it to you, it'll be your burden to carry after I'm gone. I hesitated, thinking that I might not want this secret as I looked at Grandma's face. I had seen that face smile more than anything else, but the look she had now reminded me of something else I'd seen when I was young. It was something I hadn't noticed until I looked back through the lens of time, but Grandma had always seemed a little nervous whenever she stayed at our house. I caught her more than once checking the doors and windows, looking through the living room curtains as if expecting to see someone there. It always made me think that she was scared of someone. It was a look that always made me think a stranger was trying to get in so they could take me away. The truth, it seemed, was darker than that, though. I took a seat on the bed, willing to listen, as little as I wanted to. I'm here, Grandma. If you need to tell me something, then I'll listen. She nodded, looking out the window in her bedroom like someone might be there. Your granddad didn't disappear, she said, wetting her lips with her wrinkled tongue. I killed him. That was a shock, and my face must have said as much. She smiled, without much mirth. Didn't think your old grandma was capable of something like that, huh? No, it's just surprising. You guys lived together for decades. I'm not sure why you would choose 10 years ago to. It wasn't the first time, she said, her voice as thin as a spider web. I killed your grandpa for the first time in 1973. 10 years ago was just the last time I had to kill him. I was confused, and I said as much, but Grandma only nodded. Your grandpa, your real grandpa, died in 1972, but he didn't stay dead. She laid it all out, something that took us nearly into the next day, but she never stopped looking out the window as she spoke. I realized now she was looking for Grandpa. When the call came, I was pregnant with your mother. Your grandpa had avoided the draft by attending college and had managed to avoid it again with a waiver from the government. He was an engineer working on bridges and sewer systems in D.C., and I was looking forward to having him home for a few weeks. He had promised to come home before the baby was born, and he was excited to meet his daughter. We had wanted children for years, and when we talked, you could hear the tears on the verge of coming out whenever he talked about our future. The phone call that day, however, seemed to be the end of that dream.
They said he'd been killed in a car accident, and that it had been very quick. He had been driving to a job site when someone had run a red light and slammed into the driver's side door. They said he died instantly, hadn't suffered a bit, and I suppose that should have been a mercy. They wanted to bury him in the Capitol, but I was adamant that he be buried here. I wanted his daughter to see him, to know her father, but I couldn't have known how much she would know of him. A week later, before his body was even home, I heard someone in the kitchen late one night. Grandma's voice got low, the husk making my skin crawl as she stared through the little window into the past. I must have looked aside as I came out with the baseball bat, but he never saw me coming. It was a man in military fatigues, eating a sandwich and sitting at my table like he owned the place. He hadn't bothered to turn on any of the lights, and the closer I got, the more I saw. He'd left a duffel bag on the floor beside him. There was a glass of milk sweating on the table beside his plate. His fingers slipped into the white bread, and the lettuce and tomato looked wet against the roast beef poking out. I didn't challenge him. I didn't think he even knew I was there. When I hit him in the side of the head, he went down like a sack of potatoes. I killed him in that one hit. Hit him just right, I guess, but when I went to see who it was, I felt like I might have a heart attack. It was your granddad. He was laid out on the floor, bleeding from the ears, his blood staining his fatigues. I looked up the pins he had been wearing years after the fact and realized he'd been a corporal in the army. His paperwork said he was back on leave for the birth of his child. He was on 2 weeks of leave before he went back to Vietnam. I was confused. My husband had never been in the army, and as I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I decided to just bury him in the backyard. My husband was dead, and calling up the police to let them know that this man had broken in so he could eat a sandwich would only muddy the waters. So I buried him in the backyard. No easy feat for a woman 7 months pregnant. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room folding laundry, just trying to get back to normal, when I heard a key in the front door. I heard someone coming in, set the bag down on the end table, and then I heard the last voice I ever expected to hear again. "Sorry I'm late, dear. There was something in the office I had to set up for tomorrow before coming home." It was your grandpa, dressed in a crisp white button-up and pressed suit pants. His tie was blue and white, something I'd never seen before, and it looked expensive. I'd never seen any of his clothes, and I was the one that did all the laundry. He spread his arms wide, waiting for a hug, but I couldn't move. I'd killed him. I'd killed him 3 nights ago. I watched him die, and as I backed away from him, I saw his face twist in confusion. It was painful, a look that hurt my heart. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's me. It's Wendell, your loving man." I was against the door frame, hyperventilating, clutching my stomach as your mother kicked inside me. She could sense my fear, feel my uncertainty, and she was responding in kind. He took a step towards me, and I curled into a ball as I tried to protect myself from whatever he meant to do. I expected him to try to attack me, to turn into a vengeful spirit and come after me, but instead he just wrapped his arms around me and hugged me close. "What's wrong, darling? Are you okay? Talk to me." It sounded just like him, and when I wrapped my arms around him, I realized it felt just like him, too. The smell of his aftershave, the rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek, the way his hair smelled like seltzer blue. It was all things that let me know it was him. When he hugged me to him, I gasped as I Felt the lump on his inner arm where a birth defect had left a bone poking slightly out. It was him. It was your granddad, and I just leaned into him and sobbed as he helped me to my feet and took me to the bedroom. I checked the back of his head later that night when he slept, but there wasn't a mark or anything to lead me to believe that he had been the one I'd clobbered a few nights ago. I lived with that version of your grandpa for 6 months. He worked as a manager at a paper company, his degree in business instead of engineering, and he made a comfortable living for us. If I needed a reminder of the old times, however, I only had to look at the graduation photo hanging in the hallway. It was me and your grandpa in his cap and gown, and me in my best dress, smiling as his mom snapped a photo. I caught him looking at the picture sometimes, trying to rationalize it, before finally moving away to do whatever he'd been heading out to do. He was there for the birth of your mother, and I settled into a life of maternal bliss after that. Your grandfather was much the same as he'd always been, trading talk of bridges for talk of stocks and paper sales, but he was still the same man he'd always been. He loved your mother and me dearly. We never wanted for anything, but after a while, I suspected that something was off about him. It started with the sleep-talking. He would mumble ceaselessly from the time his eyes closed till the time they opened again. Your grandfather had always been a prolific snorer, ever since he was little, as his mother liked to say, but now he never seemed to breathe at all when he slept. He would mumble on and on about sewers and the war and stocks and paper and raising dogs and breeding horses and a million other things. Between your mother's nightly feedings and your grandfather's ceaseless muttering, I had become ragged. I couldn't sleep with all that yammering, and no matter where I slept, it always seemed to find me. I tolerated it until one night when I heard something familiar. I came awake to the sound of someone chewing and mumbling. Where are they? Chew, chew, chew. I can't believe I had to make my own food. It's not enough that I, chew, 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 went and fought them for her, but now I have to make my own sandwich. I had been sleeping on the couch, trying to get some sleep away from the muttering, and as I crept up the hall, listening to him mumble, and even the squeak of the door didn't rouse him from his nightmare. She couldn't even bother to wait for me, chew, 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 just because my bus was a little late. I'm a war hero, a soldier, and she can't even chew, chew. But he paused then, before gasping harshly. Ah, my head! What the hell is that? It's Maggie. Oh, God, she's killed me. She's killed me. She's bashed my head in with a bat. I'm dead on the floor, dead right by my kitchen table. My blood's going everywhere. She's killed me. The pillow was over his face before I could stop myself. I was just so ragged, so mentally fried that I knew he would tattle on me. He'd wake up and tell the police, and they'd find the body, and he'd be here alone with your mother, and who knew what would happen then? He wasn't her father, couldn't be her father, and he might hurt her or kill her, or... She looked back at me, and I could see her eyes swimming with tears. He only struggled a little, and then I had another body to bury. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes returning to the window, before continuing again. The next one was a car salesman, but he was less like your grandfather than the one before. I read something about how if you photocopy a photocopy, the quality degrades until it's almost unrecognizable. That's how this was. The next one sounded less like your grandfather than that, was paler than him, and seemed to get lost sometimes. I lived with this one for 2 years until he suddenly wandered into traffic outside our house. I told the police that this one was a cousin of my late husband, and that was why he looked so similar. The one after that bred horses, and when one of 'em threw him, I buried him at the edge of the range where he worked and went home expecting to find another one. I was becoming pretty good at losing husbands by then, and when the next one showed up, I hit him with a frying pan and left him in the backyard with the others. By the time your mother came home from school, there was a new one in the living room, reading the paper. Over the years, I'm ashamed to say I've experimented on how durable they are. I pushed one off the roof after asking him to fix something for me. He broke his neck, and I added him to the growing mass grave in my backyard. I poisoned one over the course of a year until he finally dropped dead one morning over his oatmeal. I pushed one off a mountain during a hike, only to return to the hotel and find a new one there waiting for us. The copies became paler and less coherent. The voices became softer and less substantial. It got to the point that he couldn't hold a job. His mind was like a dementia patient, and I would look up sometimes and find him watching me through the window of wherever I was. Your mother had moved out of the house by then. A retirement check from somewhere showed up in the mailbox from a company that manufactured pipes. The money was good. The money kept us afloat, but I was tired of living with this pale ghost. Then, about 8 years ago, he walked out of the house one morning and never came back. In many ways, it was a blessing. I had become responsible for him. I had to take care of him and lead him around like a child. Suddenly, I was responsible for just me again. I kept cashing those checks until they stopped coming about a year ago, and I kept waiting for the day when he'd come back. I almost dreaded it because it would mean that he had died, and a new pale copy would take his place again. Grandma turned away from the window, locking eyes with me as the night slid by outside. Now it's your secret. It's your secret and your burden. The bodies in the back are still there. I checked periodically, and though they decompose, the bones remain. I don't know if this version of your grandfather will ever come back, but you will have to watch for him now. I've left everything here for you. The house, the accounts, everything. It's yours now, and I pray it brings you joy. She lay back then, and I could almost watch the life slipping out of her. By midnight, she was dead, and when I turned to get the phone, I saw what she had been waiting for. Gramps was paler than I remembered him, but he looked exactly the same otherwise. He waved at me as he stood there before backing away and leaving the way he had come. I went to the backyard and looked, but there was no one there, and no clue that anyone had been there in the first place. We buried Grandma in a plot next to Grandpa's original body. She lay peacefully there beside her husband. The caretaker tells me that someone comes to see her, though, leaving a single wildflower behind before moving on. I don't think he'll come back, but who's to say what the future might bring? In the meantime, I called the police to let them know about all the bodies in the backyard. The sheriff came and exhumed them, asking all kinds of questions that he didn't seem to believe the answers to. He had them tested, and to his surprise, all of them came back a match for my grandfather. Dental records, DNA, hair samples, it all comes back a match, and they were all left scratching their heads. They couldn't really charge my grandmother with anything. You can't put a dead person in prison after all, and they were left with a mystery for the ages. Either way, it's nice to have the bodies gone, and it was good that Grandma got to die at peace. As for Grandpa, I guess I'll just have to wait for the day when a new one shows up. Hopefully, I won't have a body of my own to bury when he does. I think that'll do it for us today. I hope you've enjoyed all our great stories, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble on about spooky stuff. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.